So now that we have understood everything about photosynthesis, let's understand what are the factors that affect the rate of photosynthesis. Simple but an important logic. Which factors affect photosynthesis? So let's understand the factors affecting photosynthesis. You have several factors, both internal and external. Internal as well as external factors affect photosynthesis. The internal or plant factors include number, size, age and orientation of leaves. जितने ज्यादा leaves हैं, जितनी बड़ी उनकी size होगी, if they are young leaves with more chloroplast and they are oriented in a way where they are exposed to more sunlight, then the rate of photosynthesis will increase. The number of mesophyll cells and chloroplasts in them, jitne zyada mesophyll cells and chloroplasts hai, that much more will be the rate of photosynthesis. Internal CO2 concentration, how much more is the CO2 available, that much more will be the fixation of the carbon dioxide, more is the rate of photosynthesis. And amount of chlorophyll, jitna zyada chlorophyll utna zyada light reaction, and that means more is the amount of photosynthesis. So it all depends on number of leaves, it depends on number of mesophyll cells, number of chloroplasts, how much is the CO2 concentration, and the amount of chlorophyll. These plant or internal factors depend on genetic predisposition. It all depends on the genes of the plant and genetic predisposition and growth of the plant taking place. These factors are constant for a particular species. What really makes a difference are the external factors, which include availability of sunlight. Sunlight is the first factor, temperature is the second factor, carbon dioxide concentration is the third factor, and water is the fourth factor. So we have sunlight, we have temperature, we have CO2 concentration, and we have water, which are the four factors which are external factors affecting the rate of photosynthesis. Let's understand sunlight, temperature, CO2 concentration, and water as the four factors affecting photosynthesis. सबसे पहले एक important point. When several factors affect a biochemical process, Blackman's law of limiting factors comes into effect. What is Blackman's law of limiting factor? When a chemical process is affected by more than one factor, its rate is determined by a factor which is nearest to its minimal value. तो समझो चार फैक्टर है, तो it will depend on a factor which is closest to its minimum value. मिनिमम वैल्यू से वो फैक्टर कम हो जाएगा, then photosynthesis will not take place. तो समझो चार फैक्टर है और चारों में से एक फैक्टर कम हो जाता है, then that is called as the limiting factor. For example, despite the presence of a green leaf, optimal light, CO2 conditions, the plant will not photosynthesize if the temperature is very low. So, if you remember, every plant is specific for its temperature. If the temperature becomes lower, then its limiting factor, then photosynthesis will not take place. So, in this case, leaf is present with enough amount of chlorophyll, light is present, CO2 concentration is present. So, ये सब proper factors है. But the chemical process is affected by which factor? The rate is affected by the factor nearest to its minimum value. So if the temperature is very low, so low temperature becomes the limiting factor, and low temperature becomes the limiting factor, and photosynthesis will not take place. If this leaf is given optimal temperature, it will start doing photosynthesis. तो सर ये law of limiting factor है given by Blackman. Next we have the four factors: light, we have carbon dioxide concentration, we have temperature, and we have water. Let's see these factors. Light, there is light quality, light intensity, and duration of exposure to light, where light acts as a factor. So quality of light, intensity of light, and duration of light act as a factor which affects photosynthesis. There is a linear relationship between light and CO2 fixation at low light intensities. What will happen? At higher light intensities, the rate does not show further increase. अगर light low intensity पे है, then what will happen? Photosynthesis is relatively less. As light intensity increases, rate of photosynthesis will increase. But at a very high light intensity, rate does not show a further increase. तो एक limit तक light intensity बढ़ सकती है. Low light में low photosynthesis. As the level of light intensity increases, photosynthesis becomes high. But above a particular intensity, photosynthesis will stop. And what is interesting to note is that light saturation occurs at 10% of full sunlight. तो maximum कितनी light एक plant photosynthesis के लिए use कर सकता है? 10% of sunlight. 10% of sunlight, it will show optimum photosynthesis. Optimum photosynthesis. Above 10%, more than 10%, photosynthesis will become less. Photosynthesis कम हो जाएगा. So 10% is the optimum photosynthesis for sunlight. And plants in shade or dense forests, light rarely acts as a limiting factor. And an important point to note, increase in light beyond the point causes the breakdown of chlorophyll and decreases photosynthesis, which is called solarization. तो light intensity एक particular point से ज़्यादा light अगर गिरेगी, then what will happen? The chlorophyll molecule will break down. तो chlorophyll molecule एक particular level के बाद टूट जाता है, and there is a decrease in the photosynthesis. What is breakdown of chlorophyll called as solarization, and rate of photosynthesis becomes less. So light के लिए what is the optimum light saturation? 10% of full sunlight. That is optimum. And what will happen if there is excessive sunlight? Then solarization takes place by breaking of chlorophyll, and there is decrease in photosynthesis. Then we have CO2 concentration. Carbon dioxide is the major limiting factor for photosynthesis. If CO2 concentration is very low in the atmosphere, how much is the CO2 concentration? 0.03 to 0.04%. Increase in concentration up to 0.05% causes an increase in CO2 fixation. तो जैसे CO2 concentration 0.03 से 0.05 तक जाता है, rate of photosynthesis will increase. तो CO2 बढ़ेगा तो photosynthesis ज्यादा हो जाएगा. But beyond this level, it can become dangerous over lower period. More than 0.05%, rate of photosynthesis will decrease and it will become dangerous for the plant. And C3 and C4 plants respond differently to different CO2 concentration. At low light concentration, neither group responds to high CO2 conditions. But if light intensities are high, हाँ CO2 ज्यादा है बट लाइट कम है तो फोटोसिंथेसिस नहीं होगा, बट लाइट भी ज्यादा है और CO2 भी ज्यादा है, then C3 and C4 plants show increase in rate of photosynthesis and एक लेवल तक फोटोसिंथेसिस हो सकता है। ध्यान से C4 plant show saturation at about 360 microliter, 360, and C3 plants respond to increased CO2 concentration and saturation is seen only above beyond 450 microliter. तो C4 प्लांट का सैचुरेशन कितना है 360 और C3 प्लांट का सैचुरेशन कितना है 450, which means that availability of CO2 level is limiting to C3 plant, and C3 plant respond to higher CO2 concentration by showing increased rate of photosynthesis leading to higher productivity. C3 के कंपैरिजन में, rather C4 के कंपैरिजन में 360 से C3 450 तक फोटोसिंथेसिस कर सकता है. So C3 plants respond to higher CO2 concentration by showing increased rate of photosynthesis. And it has been used in some greenhouse crops such as tomatoes and bell peppers, जिसमें they are allowed to grow in carbon dioxide enriched atmosphere that leads to higher yield. तो tomatoes and bell pepper में कार्बन डाइऑक्साइड बढ़ा देते हैं ग्रीन हाउस गैसेस में. तो समझो आप नॉर्थ पोल में एक ग्लास का ग्रीन हाउस गैस चेम्बर बनाते हो. यू मेक आर्टिफिशियल ग्रीन हाउसेस और उसमें आप टमेटोज एंड बेल पेपर्स ग्रो कर रहे हो. व्हाट विल यू डू देयर? आर्टिफिशियल लाइट यूज करते हैं जिससे लाइट रिएक्शन बढ़ेगा. और ये एक ग्रीन हाउस है तो इट्स एन एनक्लोज स्पेस. उसमें CO2 concentration बढ़ा देते हैं and as we grow them in carbon dioxide enriched atmosphere, the rate of photosynthesis will increase. तो याद रखना, as far as CO2 concentration is concerned, increase in concentration up to 0.05 increases CO2 fixation rate. What is the normal CO2 concentration? 0.03%. 0.05% तक CO2 concentration बढ़ेगा तो फोटोसिंथेसिस बढ़ेगा. C4 प्लांट का सैचुरेशन कितना है 360 और C4 3 प्लांट्स का सैचुरेशन कितना है 450. एंड टमेटोज एंड बेल पेपर्स को ग्रीन हाउस क्रॉप्स में, ग्रीन हाउस चेम्बर्स में are allowed to grow in carbon dioxide rich atmosphere leads to higher yields. That is CO2 concentration. Then we have temperature. C4 plants respond to higher temperatures and high rate of photosynthesis, if you remember, at about 35 degrees Celsius. And C3 plants have a much more lower temperature optimum of 20 degrees Celsius. तो C4 plants कौन से टेम्परेचर पे ग्रो होता है 35 डिग्री सेल्सियस पे. C3 प्लांट कौन से टेम्परेचर पे ग्रो होता है ऑप्टिमम 20 डिग्री सेल्सियस पे. Tropical plants have a higher temperature optimum than temperate plants. So tropical plants growing near the equator, which plants basically C4 plants. C4 plants grown near the equator, maize, jawar, bajra, etc. उनका temperature optimum कितना है 35 degrees. And C3 plants which grow in the temperate climates, colder climates near the pole, उनका optimum temperature कितना है 20 degrees. So C4 plants temperature optimum is 35 degrees. C3 plants optimum temperature is 20 degrees. And then we have water. Water is rarely a limiting factor, but water stress can cause stomata to close and hence reduce CO2 availability. तो वाटर अगर कम हो जाएगा, then to reduce the rate of transpiration, stomata बंद हो जाते हैं and amount of CO2 going inside the leaf will become less and the rate of photosynthesis will decrease. In other words, decreased water leading to closure of stomata and decrease CO2 and thereby decrease photosynthesis. And water stress also makes leaf wilt and reduce the surface area, so metabolic activity become less. Water stress में leaf wilt हो जाता है, so exposure to sunlight becomes less, light reaction also becomes less. तो wilting में light reaction भी कम हो जाएगा, stomata छोटा हो जाएगा, तो CO2 availability will become less और dark reaction भी कम हो जाएगा. तो ये चार फैक्टर हुए which are the factors affecting photosynthesis. Then we have absorption spectrum, which we have talked about, is a graph indicating amount of light of different wavelengths absorbed by a pigment. How much is the amount of light of different wavelengths absorbed by a pigment is called absorption spectrum. And action spectrum is a graph indicating rate of photosynthesis at different wavelengths of light. तो absorption spectrum में amount of light absorbed होती है और action spectrum में rate of photosynthesis at different wavelengths of light. So what is absorption spectrum? Amount of light absorbed. And what is action spectrum? Rate of photosynthesis of different wavelengths of light. If you remember, chlorophyll A के लिए absorption and action spectrum which vary from pigment to pigment, chlorophyll A के लिए they are coinciding. Absorption and action spectrum for chlorophyll A are coinciding. If you remember, how much is the absorption spectrum? If you remember, absorption spectrum is in violet and blue light as well as in red light. This is the absorption spectrum. And what is the action spectrum? Action spectrum is also in violet and blue light and in the red light. So we had talked about it. Chlorophyll A, याद रखना ये बहुत commonly पूछते हैं, absorption and action spectrum are coinciding. And a few statements here. Electrons during both cyclic and non-cyclic processes move from one electron acceptor to the other that has got a greater redox potential. तो एक साइटोक्रोम से दूसरे में जिसमें ज्यादा absorption, ज्यादा electron affinity है, which is called greater redox potential takes place. And just an extra point which we have done before, Calvin pathway is common to both C3 and C4 plants. Last lecture we talked about it. C3 plants में सिर्फ Calvin cycle होती है. C4 plant में पहले C4 pathway होता है, followed by C3 pathway होता है. And Calvin pathway occurs in mesophyll cells of C3 plants. Calvin cycle takes place in mesophyll cell. But in C4 plants, it does not take place in mesophyll cell, but takes place in the bundle sheath cell. We had revised it. Where does Calvin cycle take place? In case of C4 plants, mesophyll cell के अंदर C4 pathway होता है and bundle sheath cell में C3 pathway होता है. So these are just revision points that we had done. Importantly, which are the factors affecting photosynthesis? Plant factors, which are internal factors, leaves, mesophyll cell, chloroplast, CO2 concentration, and amount of chlorophyll. And which are the external factors we read? Sunlight, temperature, carbon dioxide concentration, and water. Simple points, yaad rakhna, the factors affecting photosynthesis.